The defining mission of the new Labour government in the UK, and indeed to an extent the previous Conservative government, is a dash for growth. After more than a decade with relatively low growth and with almost no productivity growth, the game is now on. How to get GDP to keep going up and go on enough upwards to pay for all the public expenditure that almost any government would be confronted with, but one for which Labour has greater potential commitment. How do you pay for the health service going forward? How do you pay for all these above inflation settlements for public sector workers? How do you pay for all the school stuff? And then how do you pay for an increase in the share of GDP going to defence? And that's before we get to paying for all the other nice to haves that the government would like. So it's growth that's the game in town. And if you're going to have growth, and for this Labour government, they have to have growth, because otherwise the pack of cards comes crumbling down, because then they can't do the public expenditure, then they can't deliver their commitments to the election. And then, well, what's the point of a Labour government if it can't deliver higher public services? So they have to have it. But it would help a lot if that's the objective, there was some consideration of what actually causes growth. Why do some countries grow faster than others? And why will some things contribute more to economic growth than other things? Well, we know about the great experience since the Second World War at least, and we know what common factors lay behind it in Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, China, and now perhaps Indonesia too. The abiding features of these countries is that they were all focused on exports and export-orientated growth, and they all funded and financed these investments through their own high levels of domestic savings. There's nothing in the current plans to do anything much about exports, let alone export-led growth. And in the UK, savings net of depreciation, capital depreciation, is less than zero. So those preconditions are just not there, and there is no evidence that anyone's going to put them in place. Instead, we're told, well, growth is all going to be determined by building lots of houses and erecting lots of wind turbines and fitting lots of solar panels. At least that's for the next 4 to 5 years. Further out, might be building nuclear power stations and lots of other things. But in the short term, and it's really a short term, 5 years, 4 years, it's all about getting those houses built and hitting a net zero target for electricity by 2030. So how does that cause economic growth? Well, when it comes to the house building, more houses employ more people. They produce real assets called houses. And there's a sense in which, yes, higher house building will be measured by higher GDP growth. But hang on a minute. Why are we building more houses? Well, the answer is the population's gone up. It's gone up a lot. And in the UK's case, I don't think anyone disputes that the main cause of the population increases has been from immigration. Some of it extremely welcome, other bits, particularly illegal immigration, not welcomed by either of the main political parties. But if population goes up, that means that GDP growth itself is not going to necessarily increase GDP per head. More people who need more houses have to support this particular programme. But, the numbers will be able to be presented as if growth goes up, provided, of course, the houses are built. On the wind turbines and the solar panels, it's worth bearing in mind that what we're doing is not doing something new. We're simply replacing one capital stock with another capital stock. So we're replacing the coal power stations, the gas power stations, and actually increasing the nuclear power stations with wind, offshore, and now onshore, and solar panels. We are decarbonising the economy. But another way around, we haven't been paying for the pollution that we've been causing through the carbon-based electricity system in particular, and now we're going to put in place different assets, and this is the crucial bit, to provide exactly the same services. And this is true in lots of sectors, that as technical change takes place, by the way, technical change is actually the real engine of economic growth, as it takes place, old assets are replaced by new. And the word is replaced, because what we're doing is essentially maintaining the service intact through time, and strictly, this is capital maintenance, not investment. Net new assets added to the system is balanced out by the old assets being taken off the system. So if you measure growth as sustainable economic growth, whilst it's absolutely sensible to get on with decarbonising, it isn't actually economic growth in any genuine sustainable sense. Now, of course, all of this growth has to be delivered. There has to be bricks, there has to be bricklayers, there has to be sites, there has to be the manufacturing capacity to build those turbines, and of course there has to be the capacity to develop the wires for networks and so on and so forth. So we have to actually do all that lot, and we have to do it relatively quickly. Here's the first problem. We don't make any of this stuff in the UK, or virtually none of it. It's all, or almost all, coming from overseas supply chains. True, their fabrication, there's a fabrication plant for offshore wind turbines in Hull, and a few other bits and pieces. But we are almost entirely at the behold of supply chains overseas, the absolute opposite of export-led growth in those great growth miracles since the Second World War. So we're going to have to think quite hard about that supply chain and work out whether we're going to pay top dollar to trump all the other people who would also like to access that supply chain, the Americans, the Europeans, those in Southeast Asia, etc. We're not the only country pushing the net zero card, albeit a bit faster. So if we want to pay top dollar for this lot, then the cost to imports are going to be higher, and then the offset to the GDP growth is going to be higher too. Now, of course, Ed Miliband tells us that energy is going to be fabulously cheaper as a result of the wind farms and the solar panels. And in one sense, he's right. The marginal cost of wind is naught. But that's not the system cost of doing all this lot. And I suspect that the other part of the contribution from the energy side to the growth story is very dependent on the notion that prices and costs are going to fall while this investment takes place. Personally, I doubt it very much, but hey, I might be wrong, and Ed Miliband might have unique insights into the future cost structure of the energy system. So we rely on foreign supply chains, and then we rely on foreign sources of finance, and it's finance we need because it's future customers are going to pay for all this lot, i.e. do the funding, not current customers. So it's debt, and some equity too, but the main part, we're looking to overseas debt markets to provide the money to pay for all this investment we're supposed to be undertaking, albeit quite a lot of it is capital maintenance. And all the time, by the way, the government's borrowing as well. So if we're looking for lots of investment from foreigners into the UK and lots of debt, you might say, well, isn't that a liability to the British economy? And shouldn't we be thinking about the implications of what is, if the house build is so big and if they shift to net zero so fast, what is a huge increase in borrowing? Shouldn't we think about how this plays out as a liability to the current consumers, but most likely the future consumers too? Because this is an enormous dash for debt which is what essentially the dash for growth is. And right now, you might say, well, we could just invent those or lean on those terrible words that everyone trots out without thinking what they mean. We're going to unlock these debt markets. Or even worse, we're going to unleash these debt markets. There is a almost infinite amount of money that foreigners have out there, which they're just dying to lend to us. So there is no constraint whatsoever. And in one sense, that's true. If you don't care how much you pay for it, if you pay enough, you can have a lot. But it's the price that counts. And the cost of capital, perhaps some of those behind the growth strategy and its costs haven't really taken into account properly, has been rising in real terms very strongly. Never mind that nominal interest rates will come down, and they will. But real interest rates are stunningly high compared with anything for the last 30 years. And with wage inflation at 6% and continuing in that domain with the public sector wage settlements that the Chancellor has in mind, we should be very cautious before we assume that the cost of capital has not at least doubled since the experience of the last 30 years. Wall of money to be unleashed and unlocked, but at a price. And that price is a lot higher than it was before. So, how is the government going to square these considerations with its great fiscal rules? We're told that this is an iron chancellor with iron discipline, and rules mean what they say, and she is going to make sure that public finances are restored to a much more positive position than that which has been caused by the great financial crash in 2007-2008, which unleashed the printing of money, and of course the huge costs that are associated with the COVID pandemic. All of this has brought us to a state of debt to GDP of effectively 100%, and it's brought us to current account deficits of the order of 3, 4, 5%, and what one might call a world of permanent stimulus. There's no plan to seriously go back to the original Keynesian rule, which is that only in recessions do we have an unbalanced budget, but in non-recessions we have a surplus to provide precisely the balance that should then be available should there be an economic downturn. So we have to think through how it is that the Chancellor is going to balance the current spending within 3 years, so no current deficit, and also have debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the Parliament. How do you do all that? Well, on the debt by the end of the Parliament, you have to either assume that the growth policy is going to work, or you cut public expenditure, or you significantly break the tax rules that you put in place in the manifesto. Capital gains tax changes and inheritance tax changes don't get you there, just like changing the VAT on private school fees isn't really a serious funding policy for education, whatever the merits of any of these policies. So growth has to happen in order for debt as a proportion of GDP to fall. It has to work. It's a one-way bet. And that's how the current account gets balanced too, because the money pours into the Treasury's coffers, which can then be handed out to the health service, the education service, and a whole series of other public sector activities. Well, it's going to need some pretty creative accounting to do this, and we already have one bit in place. Call everything you possibly can within the current spending number, call it investment, and especially call anything that looks like capital maintenance as investment. And the rules already let that happen. The truth is that a lot of what the government's proposing to do is both eminently sensible, but also it's capital maintenance. It's holding the line It isn't actually creating net new assets to set off against all that huge pile of debt. And if it goes wrong, well, the dash for debt will leave public finances in an even worse state at the end of this Parliament than they inherited. Let's hope that the government's right about growth, but let's be realistic rather than starry-eyed about what's actually likely to happen. Thank you.